It is my pleasure to introduce our lecturer for this evening, Associate Assistant Carlson, and Dr. Reed Carlson, Doctor. Reed Carlson got his MA from Luther Seminary. We share a Pentecostal charismatic childhood, and the scars they're with. But he was ordained priest in the Episcopal Church in 2015. I realized it was that far back. Then went on to receive his THD from the Divinity School at Harvard, and had the roads to prove it. And he has been a wonderful addition to our faculty. When the lecture was coming around, I thought immediately that this would be a wonderful way for him to be introduced to you and you to him. And so without further ado, I will get out of the way. Dr. Carlson.
Thank you very much for the introduction. Make sure this thing's working. Great. All right. So while in graduate school, I served as a priest in an Episcopal church in Cambridge, Massachusetts. One night after an evening worship service, I made plans to meet up with my friend Ethan Schwartz at a neighborhood pub in Cambridge. Today, Ethan teaches Hebrew Bible at Villanova University in Philadelphia, but back then he and I were classmates, and we studied under the same advisor, John Levinson, a prominent Jewish biblical scholar whose work I will speak about a little bit later. So that night I met up with Ethan outside of the pub. We walked in together, we sat at the bar, and back then, whenever Ethan and I hung out, we did what most graduate students and seminarians do. We complained. We griped about our school and other students and professors and the grind of academic study. It was lovely. We also, of course, pontificated passionately about what we were working on, and all the while we laughed a lot, especially at each other. And after a little bit, the bartender took our second drink order, and he started walking away, but then he stopped, he turned around, and he said, "I'm sorry to interrupt you guys, but you have to tell me, are you filming this or something? Is it some kind of joke?" And it was only then that I realized how this stranger must have been seeing us. Ethan is Jewish, and he was wearing a kippah like he always does. And I had come straight from church, so I was still wearing my clericals. And so indeed, at that moment, without even intending it, Ethan and I did look quite a bit like that old joke setup line, a priest and a rabbi go into a bar. Now, Ethan is not a rabbi, and I'm not a Roman Catholic priest, but certainly we looked the part. On top of that, what were Ethan and I discussing and arguing and laughing about that evening? Exactly my topic tonight, supersessionism. I'm aware that for many of you, supersessionism might be an esoteric term. My guess is that if we asked around the room, we might end up with varying definitions of supersessionism, often some of them contradicting. And this is in part because in contemporary scholarly discourse, there actually isn't a stable definition of supersessionism, and I can demonstrate that with a few examples. So we can start with a 2024 statement by the Episcopal Church on Jewish-Christian relations. So I'll just read this. A pernicious theological move, often called theological supersessionism, is the root of anti-Judaism, be it overt or unintentional, sometimes expressed in Christian life and thought. Supersessionist theology feeds the stereotyping of Jewish people by making three erroneous assertions: that Judaism is obsolete, that because of their role in the passion and death of Jesus of Nazareth, God has ended the covenant with the Jewish people, that the church has replaced the Jewish people in unique relationship with God. So this paragraph contains 4 claims about supersessionism. According to the Episcopal Church, supersessionism asserts 1, that Judaism is obsolete, 2, God has abrogated covenants with Jews because they killed Jesus, and 3, the church has replaced Jews as God's favorite. That is, the church is the new Israel. And then a 4th claim is not included in that definition. It is just kind of assumed, and actually it proves to be the most suggestive, especially given my topic tonight. Supersessionism is the root of anti-Judaism. That was part of the explanation of the statement. So with definitions like this, it is no wonder that for many contemporary, well-meaning Christians, supersessionism represents an unquestioningly negative and dangerous set of ideas. So for example, Episcopal priest and theologian Dan Jocelyn Semitkowski has called for anti-supersessionist initiatives in the church. And so with this, he intentionally references the idea of anti-racism, which is familiar from the work of Ibram X. Kendi and other critical race theorists. So I'll read what Dan says. Anti-supersessionism moves toward the re-articulation of Christian theology and practice that reconceives the relationship between the Gentile church and Israel, much as anti-racism pushes for a new arrangement of social relations. So in this way, for many thoughtful and conscientious clergy and Christians, supersessionism has taken its place among the many isms that contemporary Christians should seek to avoid at all costs. It would not be an exaggeration to say that supersessionism is the fundamental crux in Jewish-Christian relations. After the Holocaust, many Christian theologians have interrogated and rejected supersessionism as an evil Christian mutation that perverts Scripture and inevitably encourages violence. Today, in many Christian spaces, this has become axiomatic. So a Pentecostal theologian, Chris E.W. Green, articulated this consensus especially strongly in a recent monograph on biblical Christology. Supersessionism is a particularly damaging doctrine, a heresy, in fact. So certainly I believe that most of these corrections have been absolutely necessary. I would not wish to undo any of the strides that the church has made with respect to Jewish-Christian relations in the last 60 years. This being said, I do not believe that this understanding of supersessionism is complete, and the missing components risk breaking the whole thing open, whether we acknowledge them or not. We get closer to a more nuanced understanding of supersessionism when we consult the work of Anglican priest and theologian Sarah Coakley. Coakley discerned two distinct claims in classical Christian supersessionist theology, both of which, by the way, she traces back through Karl Barth. So supersessionism 1, I'm kind of summarizing here. According to Coakley, God has abrogated the first covenant with Israel and replaced it with a new covenant with the church. 2, Jesus Christ accomplished what God sought to achieve with Israel. As you can see, what Coakley calls supersessionism 1 is pretty similar to the Episcopal Church's definition. Supersessionism 2, however, adds something new. Jesus Christ accomplished what God sought to achieve with Israel. In effect, because Jesus is the Messiah, he is the true Israel. The reason Coakley's addition is so pertinent is this: most would agree that the church has made important progress refuting the various ideas associated with supersessionism 1. That is, we have rejected the ideas that God's covenants with the Jews are abrogated, that Jews are cursed for all eternity because they killed Jesus, etc. But fewer churches have been able or willing to acknowledge that supersessionism 2 is still alive and well. This is the claim that Jesus is the Jewish Messiah and that he accomplishes something in creation that Israel was called to do but could not do alone. From this confession also can we derive the claim that since the church is the community that has been gathered as a result of Christ's work, we are somehow a new or expanded or more authentic or even a better people of God. That is, we are the new Israel. If that strikes you as improper or unfair, let me ask you a question. Can any Christian honestly claim to have jettisoned supersessionism from their theology if they consistently proclaim or sing at the penultimate moment of the Eucharistic liturgy, Christ, our Passover, is sacrificed for us? The night that Ethan and I were mistaken for being the setup to a joke, the seeming inevitability of Christian supersessionism was what he and I were talking about. And I told him, Ethan, I don't want to be a supersessionist. I don't want to be anti-Jewish. I certainly don't want to be anti-Semitic, but I do want to be a Christian. And the problem is that once we Christians strip away our aspirational language about interreligious dialogue between Jews and Christians, once we've articulated all of our qualifications about the irrevocability of God's covenants, the shared heritage of our scriptures, the commonality of monotheistic conviction, there remains a claim that my faith, Christianity, makes about you, a practicing Jew. I know something absolutely fundamental about your God that you do not. Ethan thought about that for a moment, and then he slapped me in the face. No, I'm just not. No. Actually, what he said was, we need to write a book. So that's what he and I are doing. Tonight's talk is a distillation of some of the key ideas from that work in progress. And I will give you one disclaimer before going further. While the premise for that book is one that he and I have developed together, tonight I'm speaking primarily out of my own experiences and quite intentionally to my church. So consequently, I will be making some theological prescriptions that won't necessarily be in the book that he and I write together. So our launching point for this project is a recurring idea from the work of our teacher, John Levinson, which he articulated succinctly in his monograph, The Death and Resurrection of the Beloved Son. So he says this: nowhere does Christianity betray its Jewish roots more than in its supersessionism. Now, Levinson does not say this to draw a false moral equivalency between Jewish and Christian supersessionism. There are significant differences in how Jews and Christians have deployed these rhetorical strategies in history. Rather, it is to say that the reason that Christianity is supersessionist is because supersessionist discourse develops pre-existing discourses from early Judaism and the traditions of the Hebrew Bible. Like the story of Jacob and Esau and the parable of the prodigal son, Christianity is the younger sibling trying to take the birthright and blessing of its older sibling, Judaism. I believe that we as the church cannot deal with the ugliest outcomes of supersessionism if we continue to pretend that it is an entirely post-biblical Christian innovation. This claim appropriates fundamental Jewish theological ideas. It labels them as originally Christian and then immediately condemns them as degenerate. Ideological maneuvering of this kind, though it may feel helpful, actually does great damage to contemporary Jewish communities, and it does not reflect the gospel. In effect, it is saying that the biggest problems with Christianity are the Jewish parts of it. So I have organized the remainder of my talk this evening into two claims and one recommendation. Here's claim one: Israel has always been a contested term. Even in the Hebrew Bible, disagreement over who Israel is and how is one of the primary rhetorical forms of supersessionist discourse. Claim two: supersessionist discourse is foundational to both Jewish and Christian scripture. Ironically, you cannot remove supersessionism from Christian theology without making it both less recognizably Christian and less recognizably Jewish. It is my hope that I can convince you of how fundamental and intractable the issue of supersessionism really is. It's not something we can avoid through a carefully nuanced position paper or some modifications to the wording in our liturgies. That's why, in contrast, I recommend that we address anti-Judaism and anti-Semitism in the church while continuing to study and discern how supersessionism functions in our theology, with the goal of discerning what we might do about it. Is it possible for a Christian to be self-consciously supersessionist without being anti-Jewish or anti-Semitic? To be honest, I do not know. But as one of my rabbi colleagues from graduate school would say, look, I don't care if Christians think Jesus is the Jewish Messiah, just don't kill me. All right, claim number one. Let's begin with one of the more transparently supersessionist passages in the New Testament, 1 Peter 2, verses 2 to 10. In the Revised Common Lectionary Sunday readings, this passage appears on the fifth Sunday of Easter in year A. And I'll focus on the key statement in verse 9. They stumble because they disobey the word, as they were destined to do. But you are a chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, God's own people. The you of 1 Peter is straightforward. It is the Gentile church at the end of the first or beginning of the 2nd century CE. So who then are the they? A casual reader might think that this is anyone who does not believe in Jesus, but the author's systematic exegesis of the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible makes it clear that he believes the Jews specifically have been rejected by God in favor of the church. 1 Peter 2:9, I think, is the most transparent place in the New Testament where the church is referred to as a race or as an ethnos. And it is a deliberate quotation, I think, and redeployment of God's words to Israel at Sinai. So here's Exodus 19:6, translated from the Greek in the Netz translation, the New English translation of the Septuagint. And you shall be for me a royal priesthood and a holy nation. These words you shall say to the sons of Israel. To put it bluntly, 1 Peter 2 is a masterfully constructed exegetical case for Christian supersessionism. I could hardly write a better one. And it isn't the work of the church fathers or Protestant reformers or late 19th century German Bible scholars. It's right there in the New Testament. 1 Peter reassigns several of the classical markers of Israel away from the Jews and to the church. Let's look at this issue from the other side in a passage from Midrash Tanhuma, a late antique collection of rabbinic commentary on the Torah. In this text, the rabbis are discussing why it was that God gave the Torah in two forms to Moses on Sinai. The first form is the written form, that is the Pentateuch, and then the second is the oral form, which is the commentary on the Pentateuch and what came to be called the Mishnah. And I'll read a larger portion of this. So Rabbi Judah, the son of Shallum, maintained Moses desired to write down the oral law, that is the Mishnah as well. But the Holy One, blessed be he, that is God, foresaw that in the course of time, nations would translate the written law and read it in the Greek language. They would then assert, we are Israel, Anu Hein Shel Yisrael. So what is Rabbi Judah arguing here? Well, he claims that God chose to give only a portion of the Torah in written form because God anticipated that Gentiles would come along and translate the Torah into Greek. Now, historically, of course, we know that it was actually Jews in Alexandria who did this long before Christians came along. But by late antiquity, the Septuagint had already effectively become the Christian Old Testament. According to Rabbi Judah, God reasoned that with their Greek Bible, these other nations, i.e. the church, would claim to be Israel and would hold up Jewish scripture as their proof. And indeed, we see that clearly already in 1 Peter, as I showed you. So to counteract this, Rabbi Judah explained that God gave a portion of the law, the oral portion, only to the Jews, so that they alone would have the full revelation of Torah. The first thing to note here is the claim that Rabbi Judah highlights, we are Israel. As I already pointed out, this really is the crux of supersessionism. Who is the true Israel and what makes them so? In this instance, in Midrash Tanhuma, Rabbi Judah highlights possession of Torah as a mark of true Israel. But elsewhere in the discourses of early Judaism, the distinguishing marks of Israel vary. They could be descent, that is, whoever is ethnically Jewish. They could be covenantal, that is, with whom do God's promises to Abraham, Moses, or David abide? Another criterion concerned the land. True Israel are those to whom God has given the promised land. Coordinating these varying claims in innovative ways is an essential aspect of supersessionist discourse, and it's one that early Jewish and Christian communities both used. The second thing to note in Rabbi Judah's commentary is how the identifier Israel does not quite have a stable definition in his time. The identity of what Israel was and would be was up for grabs, both within and outside of Jewish communities. A good example of this is our debates over the identity of Samaritans in rabbinic literature. Today, the instability of the term Israel should be nothing new to us. In contemporary conversations, biblical Israel, Jews, Judaism, and the modern state of Israel are all distinct ideas, but for many people, they frequently overlap. at least in popular discourse, the degree to which these identifications should be conflated or separated is frequently much more of a political discussion than it is a historical or religious one. Here's the thing, though. The situation of political instability and contestation around Israel that we see today, or that Rabbi Judah saw in his time, is no different in biblical literature. The biblical authors themselves, in both the Old and New Testaments, contested what it meant to be Israel and how that label coordinated with God's activities. We see contestation around the idea of Israel even within the compositional history of the Hebrew Bible itself. So recall that there is no account of Israel in Scripture that did not come to us ultimately through Judean or Jewish hands. As you all undoubtedly recall from your Old Testament introduction courses, the political situation in the Levant in the first half of the first millennium BCE was characterized by nearly constant aggression from Mesopotamian empires. And so while the origins of many biblical traditions predate the Neo-Assyrian conquest of Israel in the 8th century, no unmediated biblical texts from that era survive. We have, inscriptions, a handful, but no biblical texts came to us outside of through Judean and Jewish hands. So as a consequence, everything we think we know about pre-exilic Israel and Judah has been edited for us by the later scribes who assembled the Bible. This idea is sometimes referred to today as Israel in Judah's Bible, and today it's associated especially with scholars like Daniel Fleming and Andrew Tobolowsky. One of the key claims that these and other scholars argue is that Israel and Judah were always independent kingdoms, and it was not until after the destruction of the northern kingdom that Judean scribes began combining Israelite ancestral traditions with their own Judean ones. So we can look at a couple examples. First is a text that is commonly thought of as one of the oldest in the Bible, the Song of Deborah in Judges 5. Then there are many scholars today who would point to this song as an authentic ancient Israelite tradition that was eventually incorporated into the book of Judges. And I won't read the whole thing, but let's just look at verses 14 to 18 of the song here. This is a kind of roll call of the tribes of Israel. And there are similar lists that appear in Genesis 49 and Exodus 1 and Numbers 1 and Deuteronomy 27 and a few other places. But there's something that makes this passage in Judges different. I've highlighted there's only 8 tribes. Only 8 of the familiar tribes in this list. And a few a few that are names that aren't traditionally tribes. Machir could be Manasseh, could be a reference to Manasseh, but Gilead is not a tribe. In other parts of the Bible, it's a region, but here it seems to take the place of a tribe. So you have Ephraim, Benjamin, Zebulun, Issachar, Reuben, Dan, Asher, and Naphtali. Missing are Simeon, Judah, and Levi. So scholars explain these lacunae by recognizing that probably at the time that the Song of Deborah was composed, biblical tradition had not yet coordinated the Judites and Levites as being members of the 12 tribes of Israel. The idea of the 12 tribes maybe wasn't even around yet. However, by the time that Judean or Jewish scribes incorporated this song into the book of Judges, it was already too well known to change the words. And you can ask any liturgist about changing the words to the Lord's Prayer to know how hard it is to change words once people know them. As biblical tradition continued to develop, Judean and Jewish scribes made other literary moves that were even more transformative. Another example is Psalm 78. This historical psalm recounts Israel's liberation from Egypt and the giving of the law and the wilderness wandering. It emphasizes, however, the Israelites' constant unfaithfulness and ingratitude to God. And it also refers to the whole people, not only as Israel, but also variously as Joseph or Ephraim. So in this is the 7th and final section. Psalm 78 reports how God responded to Israel's persistent disobedience. In referring to God's rejection of Joseph and Ephraim, the scribes probably here are alluding to the destruction of the northern kingdom. But in their hands, this historical event is a justification to redirect promises that God made to Israel instead to the tribe of Judah and to the Davidic covenant. Although God once had a special relationship with the tribes of the north, God chose Judah over the north as the true inheritors of the promises to Israel. So this brief review raises an important question. Is the Israel and Judah's Bible phenomenon an example of supersessionism? In other words, did Judean and Jewish scribes see themselves as superseding pre-exilic Israel? And as with so many questions of this kind, the answer is a frustrating, well, it depends. One challenge is that these scribes were actually creating the idea of Israel as we know it today by combining their inherited biblical traditions. More than this, though, there is also a key difference between early Jewish scribal work and what we would later come to recognize as Christian supersessionism. So Judean scribes, and later Jewish scribes, characterized themselves as a portion of a whole, that is one tribe claiming the heritage of the other 11. And if we had more time, we could look at some examples of how this maneuver repeated itself over and over again in early Judaism. If you look at the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, for example, Jews returning from exile in Babylon claimed to be the true Israel over and against those who stayed behind. Or you could look at the community behind the Dead Sea Scrolls sectarian texts and how there's a portrayal of this kind of righteous remnant of true Israel who were called to separate themselves from wider Judaism. As we saw in 1 Peter, Christian supersessionism involves a different move. It's not a portion of the whole. The Gentile church claims for itself the election of another originally distinct group. So the move is different enough, I think, that I recommend characterizing pre-Christian examples of this phenomenon as supersessionist discourse rather than supersessionism. It's a bit pedantic, perhaps, but it leaves room for a little difference, I think. All right, claim 2. Supersessionist discourse is foundational to Jewish and Christian scripture. Let's turn next to Hebrews 8, verses 1 to 13. That shows up in year C of the RCL Sunday readings in track 2 on Proper 17. In this chapter, the author of Hebrews continues his case that Jesus was not only a priest, but also the fulfillment of the Jewish sacrificial system as detailed in the Torah. And the argument is that Jesus is not from the line of priests inaugurated at Sinai. And while some would see this as a weakness, for Hebrews it turns out to be a strength. According to the author of Hebrews, the Mosaic law and the Levitical line of priests are actually flawed. If they weren't faulty, then the Jews wouldn't be in the pickle that they were then in, what with the destruction of the Second Temple by the Romans. Jesus, however, says Hebrews, is from a line of priests both older and more effective than the faulty Sinai line. Jesus is from the order of Melchizedek, and this makes all the difference. All right, who was Melchizedek? This guy shows up in 2 places in the Hebrew Bible. The first is Psalm 110. This is a royal psalm. It contains monarchic ideology connected to the house of David and to Jerusalem. It also contains a number of textual ambiguities that make it difficult to place historically and sociopolitically. We won't get into those, but here's at the bottom. One of the most important ambiguities in the psalm is the figure Melchizedek himself. Is this a proper name? Perhaps some ancient figure associated with pre-Israel Jerusalem, as some people have speculated. Or was it not a name at all, but just a descriptor, Melchizedek, that is in Hebrew, my rightful king, or something similar like that. Whatever Melchizedek might have meant in some ancient form of Psalm 110, by the time the term was incorporated into the Pentateuch, it was a fully fledged, perhaps a semi-divine priestly figure. So Genesis 14 contains this kind of odd story of Abram's military campaign against 4 eastern kings. I don't think this shows up in the lectionary, thankfully, in the Sunday readings. At the end of that story, after his victory, Abram meets Melchizedek. Now, why is Melchizedek so useful to the author of Hebrews in this passage? One reason is obvious. I mean, come on, he's got bread and wine, right? So, like, there's that. But second, he is a priestly figure with greater antiquity and thus greater authority than Moses and Aaron. Not only is Melchizedek not a Levite, he's not even Jewish. And Abram, the ancestor of the Jews, is paying him homage. Further, Melchizedek is called the King of Jerusalem. He performs no sacrifices, but he does accept offerings. These attributes of Melchizedek are what allow the author of Hebrews to claim that the tabernacle was but a sketch and a shadow of the true heavenly temple. It's what allows him to say that Jesus' ministry was more excellent than that of Moses, and that Jesus is the mediator of a better covenant. Hebrews 8 is supersessionist language, plain and simple. It's no big deal that the temple is gone, says the author of Hebrews. The Jewish cultic system was inferior and faulty anyway. Here's the thing, though. As supersessionist as this is, Hebrews is still derivative. Melchizedek was already an eschatological and quasi-divine figure in certain corners of late Second Temple Judaism. Moreover, Hebrews is basing its own conclusions on the Bible itself. So the next passage, the next part of the passage here, Hebrews quotes and interprets Jeremiah 31, verses 31 to 34, which occurs as the first reading on Lent 5 in year B, as well as on Proper 24 in year C. Jeremiah 31, 31 to 34 is from a family of related passages in the Hebrew Bible that envision a future moral transformation for the people of Israel. The idea is that God's chosen people have repeatedly proven themselves unable to follow Torah faithfully, so God promises to change their moral orientation. In these passages, the imagery used to describe this transformation is embodied and almost surgical. In Jeremiah, it's writing Torah on the heart. In Deuteronomy, it's circumcising the heart. In Ezekiel, it's a heart transplant, the heart of stone and the heart of flesh. And in Psalm 51, it is a spirit transplant, removing the broken spirit and replacing it with a willing one, a pneumectomy, if you will. As you can see from the highlighted portions, the author of Hebrews simply attaches the promise of this future transformation to Jesus and claims it is accomplished with the authority of that primordial priest, Melchizedek, who perhaps was just Jesus himself all along. Here's the thing, though. For Hebrews, the fulfillment of this prophecy includes a rejection of God's people. And this is because the version of the Bible that he is reading says so. So let's compare three ancient versions of the New Covenant text in Jeremiah. All right. So the top one is the Hebrew. And in Protestant Bibles, typically this is what they work from, is when doing like the translation we read in church. They're working from the Masoretic text. The middle one is from the Greek translation of the Hebrew, and then below it is Hebrews. This is the same portion of Jeremiah as it is preserved in all three. All three communicate similar transformations of the moral organs, so that part is the same. Where they differ, however, is in how they characterize the nature of that break from old to new. In Hebrew, verse 32 deploys the marital metaphor, which maybe many of us know from other parts of the Bible, especially in the prophets. The marital metaphor goes like this: Israel and God are married. Israel is a straying, unfaithful wife whom God disciplines but does not divorce. This metaphor frequently creates problems from the perspective of feminist biblical interpretation. Even so, it does accomplish one thing: it secures the eternal one-sidedness of God's covenant with Israel. Basically, no matter how far the chosen people stray, God will never end the relationship. That is, God will never abandon that covenant. In the marital metaphor, God's special relationship with Israel is guaranteed not by fulfilling Torah, but through inviolable marital love. So, thus, though the gender dynamics rightfully make us uncomfortable, it is worth remembering that whenever we encounter the marital metaphor in Jewish sources, it implies what Christians might call grace righteousness, not works righteousness. But this is not the case in the Greek version of Jeremiah. That does not contain the metaphor. Look at verse 32. They did not abide in my covenant, and I was unconcerned for them. So I won't get into the textual argument here about which version might be older. I only want to note the difference because it's the Greek version that the author of Hebrews is interpreting. So let's look at Hebrews 8 again. Because the author of Hebrews notes that God was unconcerned for Israel, it allows him to ask and answer a supersessionist question. Who actually is this new Israel with the transformed heart? For the author of Hebrews 8, it is the predominantly Gentile church as it is congregated around Jesus, and not the Jews who are still hung up on that old inferior covenant at Sinai. In this way, Hebrews goes beyond the Greek version of Jeremiah. The old covenant and anyone associated with it is obsolete, and according to Hebrews 8:13, they will soon fade away. All right, so we've come to my recommendation. And it's about focusing on anti-Judaism and anti-Semitism and thinking some more about supersessionism. How do supersessionist ideas manifest today in our worship and preaching? Most of you who are preachers, I assume, are not regularly proclaiming from your pulpit that the church is the new Israel. And yet, so much of our liturgy and hymnody shape us into thinking this way. This past spring, I was asked to pray the following collect from the Book of Common Prayer during our Easter Vigil service here in Swanee. O God, whose wonderful deeds of old shine forth even to our own day, you once delivered by the power of your mighty arm your chosen people from slavery under Pharaoh, to be a sign for us of the salvation of all nations by the water of baptism. Grant that all the peoples of the earth may be numbered among the offspring of Abraham and rejoice in the inheritance of Israel through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. Now, this collect, which is positioned amid the Old Testament readings of the Easter Vigil, is not overtly hostile to Jews or the idea of God having a chosen people. Far from it. Even so, I hope by now you can recognize how inescapably supersessionist it really is. Why did God liberate Israel from slavery? Not for their sake, but for the sake of the nations. What was the miracle at the sea? A sign or a prefigurement of baptism. What is it that we should all hope for? That all people might be numbered among the offspring of Abraham, effectively erasing Jewish particularity. Who can enjoy the inheritance of Israel? All, but only those who recognize Christ as Messiah and Lord. Actually, when you stop and think about it, you realize that the church actually has very little traditional language to talk about Israel in the Bible that isn't supersessionist in tone and implication. I think that's part of the challenge, is that our well is already pretty supersessionist. One way that biblical scholars have attempted to mitigate this phenomenon is to emphasize the evident Jewishness of the New Testament and of the figures of Jesus and Paul in particular. The so-called new perspective on Paul and people like E.P. Sanders or N.T. Wright might come to mind as examples of this approach. Even more recently, there is a new perspective, sometimes called Jesus or Paul within Judaism. And one of the implied conclusions of the within Judaism approach is that regardless of what the New Testament may claim, when we study the historical Jesus and the historical Paul within their late Second Temple Jewish context, we can see that they really were just saying the sorts of stuff that other Jews of the same period were already saying. For many Christians, this approach offers an attractive solution. After all, if it can be shown that Jesus and Paul were just unremarkable first-century apocalyptic Jews, how could the New Testament that tells us about them be anti-Jewish, anti-Semitic, or supersessionist? It's comforting to tell ourselves that all that problematic stuff is really just post-biblical, a product of early Christian ignorance and xenophobia. Thus, at least from a certain kind of Protestant point of view, precisely because supersessionism is so terrible, it is also quite easy to leave behind, because we don't have to associate it with our scriptures or with our favorite figures. I have many problems with this easy road. Here are two. First, it should go without saying That just because something is Jewish, that does not mean that it can't be anti-Jewish. We could point to Jesus' diatribe against the Pharisees in Matthew 23, for example. We could compare it to similar discourses in the Dead Sea Scrolls. Plus, as I have already shown you, supersessionist discourse actually is inherently Jewish. Ironically, the more Jewish you make the New Testament, the more supersessionist it becomes. But my second objection is more directly theological. Scholars will inevitably debate the historical merits of the within Judaism approach. And since I'm not a specialist, I won't weigh in on that. There are people who know about this stuff in the room, even. So let's just bracket that off for now. But even if it just turns out that Jesus was just a regular first century rabbi who was executed by the Romans, what are we doing here? What's the point of any of this? Right? Surely there must be something new about the gospel, right? There must be something so wildly transformative about Christ, his death and resurrection, that the world would never be the same. Isn't that what we are called to proclaim? I think most preachers actually are aware of this dissonance. After all, the trajectory of our liturgy and hymnody brings us on this journey to the uniqueness of Jesus as we experience him in the sacrament. The problem for many preachers, I think, is that if we are no longer permitted to talk about how Jesus is different in the theological, gospel-centered, even supersessionist sense, we need to come up with some other ways to make him stand out from his Jewish context. Rhetorically, at least, our weekly scripture readings basically demand that we present Jesus as special, or at the very least novel, with respect to his first century context. Our usual default is to follow the anti-Jewish cues from tradition, or even from the text itself. I think this is how you end up with sermons that disparage Judaism as uniquely exclusive rather than inclusive, or as more misogynist than surrounding cultures, or as hopelessly superstitious and stuck on ritual purity, or as paradigmatically hypocritical, or as religious but not spiritual, or any of the dozens of other stereotypes and tropes that we are all familiar with. Of course, none of these characterizations are true historically, especially when compared to Christian tradition. The church can be every bit as exclusivist, patriarchal, etc. as anyone else, often more so. Even so, I hear too many well-meaning preachers who seek to avoid supersessionism by slipping into anti-Judaism. And this is where work by Jewish New Testament scholars like Amy Jo Levine and resources like the Jewish Annotated New Testament can be really helpful. Friends, if you don't know how to proclaim the gospel without disparaging Judaism, you have a theological problem. So let me close with one thought. One of the homiletical practices that I try to model for my seminary students is to preach the Jewishness of the New Testament and the Christianness of the Old Testament. This strategy often helps me avoid some of the worst stereotyping and villainization of Judaism that I think it's very easy to fall into. More than this, though, it also helps me stay close to what I see as one of the central animating theological problems of the New Testament. How is it that the death and resurrection of Jesus entangled Gentile Christians like myself with someone else's God and into someone else's liberation story? For as much as the early church agonized over this puzzle, it is remarkable how little we are all bothered by it today. This may be because, as theologian Willie Jennings puts it, and quote, "In truth, the election of Israel never significantly entered into the social imagination of the church. Israel's election has not done any real theological work for Christian existence." End quote. For contemporary thoughtful theologians and preachers who don't want to backslide into prejudice, but do want to contemplate these fundamental issues, it may turn out that supersessionism is more of a feature than it is a bug of our faith. Thank you. I think there's time for questions. 15 minutes. Do we have a system for doing questions, or we're just... All right. Yes, sir.
Really, thank you so much. I mean, tied in really, really closely with the process theology course earlier last semester. And I really like the importance of where you tie into the confusion that we've got of overlapping prejudices. So there's anti-Judaism, which is theological, and there's anti-Semitism, which is racial, and now we've got anti-Israelism, which is political. I like the way that, I think what think about it, the way you're talking about supersessionism is Jewish supersessionism, Christian supersessionism, some of us being, they're not Israel.
Mm-hmm.
How do we tie into expressions of we are not Israel? I was thinking because of the crisis theology course, they sort of trial of God. So
Mm-hmm.
put God on trial. It's not that we have failed God, it's that God has failed God.
Yeah. I mean, that is a really excellent question. Yeah. I think that's the theologian I quoted at the end, Willie Jennings, who probably many people know, that occurs in the last chapter of his book, The Christian Imagination, which is a post-colonial systematic theology, and a good portion of the book is reflecting on the place of racism in European colonialism and in the theology of colonialism. And it's interesting that he closes the book. The last chapter is this chapter about supersessionism. And the name of that chapter is Those Near Belonging. And that's his description of the church, is those near belonging, as being in those being in proximity to Israel, but not necessarily of Israel. And it's an idea I keep sticking with. Ultimately, I think Jennings still doesn't want to admit the intractability of supersessionism. And so with that, I think I probably disagree with him, but overall, it's really excellent work, like, obviously. I used this in class, but it's one that's been sticking with me too. The parable of the workers in the vineyard. The church is, we showed up 5 minutes before the whistle, and we got a full day's pay. And the correct response to that is humility, and gratitude. And too often instead, we've looked at the Jews who have been working in the vineyard and said, "You idiots, what's this works righteousness that you're doing? We're working all day. This is free. Didn't you know it's free grace?" And what a like backwards way to respond to the grace we've received, So that is far from Elie Wiesel, certainly, but it's what comes to mind when I think about how can we think about having a special relationship with God, but not being Israel, or being Israel. There's the grafting image in Romans, and yeah, Greg.
Great, Father. This is even better the second time. We had a full version of this class a few months ago. You kind of just touched on it, but what are some of the texts that come to mind when you think about how to more effectively talk about this?
Yeah.
You just talked about, you mentioned the workers in the vineyard
Yeah.
class. And I think in class I brought up, it was a passage from either Zechariah or Malachi that talks about Gentiles moving to the road to Jews, saying, "Show us God." Like,
Yeah.
knows God.
Yeah.
Right? Are there any other particular texts?
So I think, like, there's the ideal environment of like a classroom where you can like dig into stuff, but then there's like the parish environment, and which is ideal in a different way. And in a classroom, we can go into some of these texts that want to explore some of these texts that are in the Old Testament that explore the place of Gentiles with respect to the God of Israel. Third Isaiah stands out, especially Isaiah 56. My friend Ethan, with whom I'm writing this book, he likes to say that the scandal of this whole topic is that the most supersessionist text in the entire Protestant Bible is Third Isaiah. Is it not? It's not even in the New Testament. But I think in a parish environment, it's really hard to get into that because most people don't even know what supersessionism means or why. Like I think it's just like. You can talk about it for a while, and then they'll just be like, "So you're saying we should be nicer to Jews?" And right? Is that what you're saying? And like in some sense, like if that's all they have, that's not a bad idea to walk away from, frankly, given Christian history. But like the reality for me is that let's say that one of the many genocidal attempts in history of wiping out the Jews was successful, and there were no Jews left. This would be no less of a problem for the church. Argue it would be an even bigger problem, is because and so in that sense, it's different from how we might think of other kind of interreligious dialogues. Our foundational text uses another tradition to define itself constantly, and our most foundational theologians and thinkers are using something called a Jew to think about who our God is, and so to go back to your original question, what texts? What if when we read about if we're going to preach a sermon about Abraham, what if we read it as if we're Hagar, not Abraham? What if we do Jonah? What if we're Nineveh, not Jonah, in the sermon? I don't know that anyone's preaching about Naaman the Syrian, but there are these figures. Ruth, yeah, there we go. Ruth maybe is a great opportunity to explore this. Although Ruth, in some ways, she's a full-on convert to Judaism. So in some way, it doesn't quite work, but decenter, finding a way to have your congregation try on decentering, as if we're not the center of this great story. We're the ones, and this, by the way, if we think about in the New Testament, these various in various places, they're called like God-fearers. Basically like Gentiles who are like into the Jewish God. Like if they're reading the Greek Bible, is that who they were seeing themselves as these kind of, I don't know, Balaam the prophet kind of, like people on the outside looking in? Maybe something could come from that. And it's also less didactic, but more of a kind of narrative approach into thinking about it, rather than just assuming like we're Abraham and we need to be more inclusive of, some, I don't know, whatever. Yeah.
When you say that Christians have not adequately adopted the election of Israel into our social imagination, is it your sense that we just don't care, or is it your sense that it's Star Wars? We start with episode 4 and some stuff happened before, or is it like, well, God happened to choose them, but we were going to get to Jesus anyway. So it could have been a different people.
Yeah. So this is Jennings' argument, and as I recall, his critique is that the church so quickly adopts everything that God says to Israel and puts it on itself. And I'm going to give you this. I'm going to bless you for this, and you need to go and do this, and all this. And what he's prescribing is that the church needs to go back and think about what it means that God said this to someone else, and that the fact that we are included we are included in the sense of we are the proof that God's promises to Israel are fulfilled. It's not for our sake, it's still for Israel's sake. This is Jennings' argument. Like he really uses the Gospel of Matthew for this. Jesus came for Israel, lost sheep of Israel, and so on. And so we're the gravy on top of that proves that it worked. And so, yeah, I think that's something we're thinking about. This is why I frame it as like we need to think about it, because there's the idea of the people of God is so integral to ecclesiological construction of like to so much that it just doesn't work. That's part of what I kind of want to say is like, well, we can't just change our liturgy and pretend like we fixed this, right? It's more than that. It's and not that isn't a necessary and perhaps arguably the step that would have the biggest effect on the church as a whole. But yeah, changing one or two collects as a kind of symbol. Not that that's what people are doing, but you know what I'm saying. Yeah.
One thing that I hear particularly sort of the advantage of presentation is very often it's our reconciling impulse that's going to do more damage than letting the contesting truth claims stand by side. We talked about preaching the Christianness of the Old Testament, the New. As someone who remembers the confirmation class visit, like we're going to go to the synagogue and we're going to go to the mosque, we're going to go to the Catholic Church, and this is the nice how at the end of the day we're all the same.
Yeah.
What are some other ways you can think of to graciously hold those truth differences while also showing the proper respect? Like you said, it may be that supersessionism really is a piece of our work.
So this is part of why I wanted to tell the story of my friendship with Ethan, is because he and I disagree. I think he, like according to our confessions, in his mind, I'm an idolater. And in my mind, he missed his own Messiah, and like that obviously is not a great basis for a friendship, but and yet, it's something we laugh about all the time, and
That's why he was a rabbi in training. And at some point, I slipped and referred to Jesus as being dead, and his moment was,
you knew, Like I think that there is an impulse for us to try to articulate. Is there some way? This is where a lot of Jewish-Christian relations go. Is there something that we can say, some perfect articulation of words, where we can say something about Jesus that both Jews and Christians, if they do enough mental gymnastics and like squint a little bit, could theoretically agree on? And that's like lowest common denominator, and you just end up saying nothing, And that is actually a product of our privilege as Christians, as being the bigger power, is because when Christians come down and we sit, this is something my teacher Levinson would say, I'm paraphrasing a lot of it, but when Christians come down to the Jewish-Christian relations talking circle, we sit down and we're like, why are you still here? We have to figure this out. We've been thinking about this for a long time, and it's your Messiah and your God, but we're right, but you're still here. And it's like this intellectual, theological, confessional problem that we're trying to work out for ourselves. When Jews come to the Jewish-Christian relation table, it's what can I do or say to stay alive? To avoid being disenfranchised in a pluralistic world. And so the stakes are fundamentally different. And we're trying to come up with it's in many ways it's our universalizing impulse to try to say, isn't there some version of my faith that you can attest to intellectually? Here, let me try this one. And from a Jewish perspective, it's the response is just, can't we just be a little bit more particular? You claim your particularity, I'll claim my particularity, and then we don't have to be violent at the end of it, right? So I think that's being open about difference, and of course the kind of interpersonal friendship thing is maybe where I go. Yeah. Yeah.
If you have had any reactions from the theological crowd that's been digging into supersessionism and like trying to like work around it.
Yeah.
What are their reactions to this? Whether it's Jennings or somebody else.
Yeah.
Like, what's the breakdown?
Yeah.
That's not to say that criticism is right.
Yeah.
But I'm just curious, like, what's the perspective?
So I would say that Ethan is the more outspoken one between the two of us in both on like social media and in scholarly settings. He has said more than I have on this point. But he also has a positionality. He's the lone Jewish faculty member at a Catholic university, and in some way they want him there so he can call people on their BS, and so I just have one publication that isn't even out yet where I'm kind of doing this, and I'm only really just starting to do this a little bit more, and my positionality is different because for me as an Episcopal priest to be like, maybe supersessionism isn't so bad is like, it's a different kind of yeah. Yeah, it's fine. All my best friends, I got good Jewish friends, and so yeah. What I would say is part of the reason why I think we differ is because we're biblical scholars, and most of the people in this conversation are theologians, and there's just different. Not that like we know, not that kind of stuff, but just the goals are different, and then I think truly it's our teacher Levinson who's been saying this stuff for 20 years. So yeah.
Just a quick follow-up.
Yeah.
I know because I sat in on that class. We talked a bit about how what you began with, which is the way that in today's discourse, just supersessionism, but also Judaism, days of grace, some have been lumped all into one thing.
Yeah.
That's one of those trying to make things better that makes things worse.
Yeah, I mean, often, and I think we have to like qualify what's being accomplished. Like again, if the only thing people get out of it is like, maybe we've been a little too hard on the Jews. Like that's a great thing. Yeah, like let's just leave it at that, and maybe I should just shut up. But like, I do think that there is a kind of uncritical equating of that erases, to use the same term, that erases the particularity of the anti-racist work that the church needs to do, and the work on supersessionism that the church needs to do, which are obviously related exercises, but different enough to warrant different conversations. Yeah. But both being absolutely